Tuthilltown, take one, soft sticks marker.
It's funny, we still use that.
Yeah.
You know, even today.
Even
We
today.
still use that damn thing. Click.
It's great because we're recording audio in both places.
Yeah.
And we can match them up much easier.
Yes, I'm sure.
If there's something that goes wrong, we still have that slate.
The analog version.
Yeah. The old school.
Yeah.
Still lives. David's happy with that.
I remember when I first studied video production, this is in the 80s, in the 70s, mid-70s, and we had to thread the tape through the machine by hand, and then we had to do a white balance. You know, I mean, it was really a lot more cumbersome than it is today.
Digital has changed.
Yes, completely. Changed everything.
Let's,
Okay.
let's start out with who you are, where we're at, what's the name of the distillery,
Okay.
and your product line.
My name is Ralphie Renzo. I am one of the co-founders with Brian Lee of Tuthilltown Spirits in Gardner, New York in the Hudson Valley. We produce artisan agricultural spirits, including whiskey and vodka, gin, and a variety of aperitifs and liqueurs. And we were the first distillery to open in New York since Prohibition.
Which is very significant. I'm not sure how far back to go, but how did you get into distilling?
Well, the whole adventure started in 2000 or so when I discovered this property that we're at now. The Tuthilltown Gristmill property was for sale. 36 acres, 3,000 feet of riverfront, a 200-year-old mill still producing flour, and all these working buildings and a lot of property, and this great river right next to us. And I bought it with the goal of setting up a climber's ranch. This area is known all over the world for the gunks, it's called. It's the ridge that's over there on the edge of the valley, and it's world-class style climbing. It draws climbers from over the world. And there's never been, I've been climbing here 30 years, there's never been a camping area dedicated to the climbers. It's always been really ad hoc. I slept a lot of nights in the back of my car and under my pickup truck, and always with the thought that one of these days I'm going to solve this problem. So when I bought the property, that was my goal, was to turn the granaries into a bunkhouse and a shop, and put a little cafe in, have the main house be a bed and breakfast, and then open up camping in the field to climbers with tents. And the folks across the river didn't like the idea of my raping, pillaging climbers in their neighborhood. And so they came down and told me they wanted me to do something else, which of course I couldn't do because I had already invested quite a bit of money into the project. And their comment was that we'll just install you until you run out of money and have to sell the place and move away. And that went on for about 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, I'd already sold off 15 acres of the 36. And and ran out of money completely, and had to figure out something else to do that I could make a living from on the property, and because everything I had was sunk in here. And so I called the local zoning officer. I started by calling him over and asking him to walk around with me and tell me what I could do that I had a right to do here to make a living, that no one could challenge. And he said, you're in a farm district, and in New York, if you're located in an agricultural district, you have a constitutional right to farm. And he pointed out that wineries are a farm use. So he started me down that road, and I started exploring winery law and the industry in New York, and it was just too crowded. There were 128 other wineries in New York at the time, and wine takes a long time. I mean, whiskey takes a long time too, but it's different. And also, I wasn't that enamored with wine and wineries and grapes and things like that to begin with. So, but in the course of reading the law, I was puzzled why there were no distilleries in New York. And I started reading distillery law and realized that there had been a permit fee for distilleries since Prohibition had been $65,000. And that very year that I was looking into it, the state had changed the law, added a new license class, and the permit fee for that new license class, which was designed for small distilleries, was dropped from the $65,000 down to $1,500 for 3 years.
That's a huge change.
Enormous, enormous.
Since you were looking into it at the time, did they recognize that, oh, we should encourage people to do this, we can tax them? I mean, what was the...
Well, at the time, first of all, no one had actually applied for that license yet. And I saw it as an opportunity because I thought we could be the first ones. I could be the first one to get one and be the first one to make whiskey in New York since Prohibition. And I thought that would be a good tourist draw as well. At the time, distilling was not recognized as an agricultural use unless you had a winery and you put in a still to make brandy. Then it became an accessory use to the farm, and it became a farm use. So I spent the winter fermenting apple cider in my basement and distilling it off on my kitchen stove in a little tea kettle still I made from a design I got off a website called dangerouslabs.com. And I was just trying to figure out what's going on inside the still because I had zero experience and knew nothing about making spirits. And at the end of the winter, I found that I felt very confident about it. I thought if I had a little more education, better equipment, I could do this. And with 500,000 visitors a year coming through this neighborhood on their way to the state park and the preserve and the university and everything else around here, I figured I could make a living off this. So I started to fill out the application papers. And that's when the fellow who would end up my business partner, Brian Lee, showed up. And he's an electrical engineer. And wanted to get out of that business and get into something that he could actually make a product and sell it. And he had just gone back to the university and gotten his MBA, so he had that burning a hole in his pocket. He wanted to start a business. And he wanted to buy the mill from me. At the time, the mill was still producing kosher matzah flour every year. We had a whole team of kosher distillers up here, Hasidic distillers up here, and they lived on the property for 3 months and did nothing but grind flour for 3 months. And they'd store it in the granaries under rabbinical seal, and then come collect it in the spring at Passover time, bring it down to a Brooklyn bakery and make very high-end matzah. And so they were still doing that at the time. He wanted to buy the mill from me and make flour and cornmeal, artisan products that he could feed the locavore market with up and down the valley and in Manhattan. And I said, that's great idea. Go spend some time with the crew and see if you like it. And he came back 2 days later and told me that it wasn't a career change, it was a death sentence. And I agreed, you know, he would be making a commodity product you can buy in every grocery store in the country for $2.50. Doing it with a 240-year-old water-powered machine. It's a wooden machine, it's just not practical. So I started to tell him about this idea I had for the distillery. And I gave him the whole elevator pitch, as it were, and he wrote me back an email 3 days later, and all it said was, okay, let's build a distillery. And that's how we formed the partnership and started the business. We were mail order brides. We knew nothing at all about each other or about the industry we were going to get into, which, as it turns out, is the most competitive, highly regulated, and highly taxed industry in the world. And so we started, and we built out these 2 buildings into the distillery buildings and storage building ourselves. We did everything, plumbing, drywall. We built the furnaces, literally built them from scratch ourselves after taking them apart out of the basement of a church in Cincinnati. We trucked them back here and reassembled them here. And that's how we got our steam furnace. We got our still from Germany, from a company in Germany that made it for us. And we were on our way, and we produced our first products in 2005. That's when the first whiskey started flowing out of the still. Of course, then it gets aged. So it wasn't until 2006 that we actually introduced our first whiskeys, the Hudson whiskey line. We also, at the time, had a vodka made from local apples, which we still make now under a different brand. It's called Indigenous now, but it's 100% Hudson Valley apples. And with those 2 products, I started selling them up and down the Hudson Valley out of the trunk of my car. And after a little while, I had about 128 placements in New York City and up and down the valley. We only went into the best places we could find because we had a fairly pricey artisan product, and we needed to go to people who understood that and why it was like that, because it's totally handmade. And then we picked up a distributor who put us out into 22 other states. And then we got a phone call after a couple of years, I guess in 2009, we got a phone call from William Grant and Sons. It's a 128-year-old Scottish whiskey house, very renowned worldwide. And they'd been watching us and wanted to come and talk to us about our products. They came up and visited, and we took a tour with them here at the distillery and with the CEO and the head of the innovations department. And in the end, they wanted to buy the whole place. And of course, we had just spent 6 years building the place from scratch and everything we had on it. So we said to them, you're probably not going to want to write a check big enough to make us walk away from this thing, because it's not worth that much to you. You could build one cheaper. And they said that they agreed with that. And so we finally agreed to sell them the Hudson brand. So now we continue to be the sole source of Hudson whiskey, and all of what we make goes straight to William Grant, and they distribute it internationally. And now we're worldwide.
And let's cut sound, cut camera.
Camera's got speed.
It's a pretty amazing story.
Tuthilltown take 2, marker.
What were, going back to the kind of start, what were some of the financial challenges you guys faced?
Oh,
How did you do this?
it was constant. Brian remortgaged his house. I had the property, so I threw that in, so we weren't having to pay rent for a while. And all of the other work, we literally did it ourselves because we couldn't afford to pay anybody else to do it. I think that we calculated after a couple of years that if we had hired other people to do all the work we did, it would have cost us almost 5 times as much to build the place and get it open. So, and we learned what we needed to know along the way. You know, when it came time to reconfigure the stainless steel on the still, Brian arrived the next day with a MIG welder and handed it to me and said, "Today you learn how to weld stainless." And so I took the next 6 weeks or so figuring out how to weld stainless, and then went at the still itself and reconfigured it so that we could make vodka. That was early on.
What was the very first product? Was it the whiskey or the vodka?
Well, actually, the very first thing we made was, actually the very first thing I ever ran through the still was a batch of absinthe. But the first thing we made from scratch here was the apple vodka, because we could, because it was readily available. We didn't have to cook anything because the sugar is already available in the apple cider, as opposed to grain where we have to convert starches to sugars before we can use them. And so the vodka was the handiest thing. It was also something we did not have to age, so we could put it on the marketplace immediately. And we were very excited about our first starter advantage. We had a clear field for almost 4 years after we opened up with nobody else making whiskey in New York. Not until 2007 when the Farm Distillery Act passed. So for the first 3 years we were in business, we couldn't have a shop, we couldn't do tours, because over the years wineries and breweries had gone back and changed the Prohibition era laws and gotten permission to sell to consumers. Because in the US, if you're a producer, you shouldn't be selling to consumers, you have to sell to a distributor. And the distributor has to sell to retailers, and the retailer sells to the consumer. But on farm operations, you can sell direct in New York. And so we started lobbying in New York right away to change the license, and it ended up 3 years later with the Farm Distillery Act, which the governor signed into law in 2007. And that came with the ability to have a shop and do tastings and samplings and sell direct to consumers, which put us in the tourism business, which really made all the difference in the world. In 2007, when that law passed, we were the only distillery in New York State. Since 2007, 60 more distilleries have opened as a direct result of the governor's support and the fact that we have this new law in place.
When you say kind of a tourist business, what do you mean?
Well, the shop draws visitors. The Hudson brand has a whole cadre of followers that want to see where is it made, how is it done, who are the guys that are making it. And so now that we have the shop, we can actually accommodate visitors. Before we had the shop, if visitors came up, we'd take them on tours, but they were in the way. We couldn't sell them anything. And we couldn't offer them a taste of anything either because the law wouldn't allow us. So it sort of was a lost opportunity. And if you spoke with any winery in the state of New York and you asked them, what would you do if you had to shut down your tasting room? Their answer would be, I'd have to close down. because the tasting room is the best sale you can make. You're not paying a distributor's markup and a retailer's markup. You're getting it directly from the source. And so that helped us enormously with spreading the word and getting people to make a connection with the distillery, which is what we were after.
Did you have something to do with that? Were you pushing for that yourself, or did you?
The Farm Distillery Act,
Yeah.
that was my major focus for the first 3 years. Apart from selling, I was in Albany constantly learning how to lobby. I was learning how to be one of those guys. And we were very successful with the help of the Farm Bureau and a number of other small aspiring distillers at the time. We headed to Albany, and it took a couple of years to get it passed. But when it passed, it was a huge step forward.
So it sounds like that was a major part of your life for a little while. But you
Absolutely.
guys recognized that to make this business work, you had to have people coming here, tasting, as you were saying.
Yes, that makes all the difference in the world. This shop probably covers our payroll. When we started, it was Brian and me. That's it. After about a couple of years, when we got it built and ready to run, that's when my son Gable came on board and ran the distillery for 2 years and eventually moved into the brand ambassador role. But when he came on board, that's when I started being on the road most of the time selling. And he took care of production. He and Brian took care of production. They made sure I had whiskey to sell. I made sure it got sold.
And you taught Gable how to be a master distiller.
Well, I wouldn't say master. None of us are masters around here. We're all journeymen. We're all still learning. But we taught him everything he needed to know. Brian and I taught him everything he needed to do to run our distillery, which is, how we designed it. And at the time, of course, there was no manual or guidebook on how to build this craft distillery. Nobody had done it. So we really were making it up all along the way. And we're in a constant state of construction for the last 10 years. We're constantly expanding to meet demand and putting on new employees. Up until about 5 or 6 years ago, there were just maybe 4 or 5 employees. Now there are 60.
That's pretty amazing.
And we've bought back all the property we had to sell off to stay alive. So we've bought back the first parcel I sold, and we bought back the waterfront parcel, which I sold about 6 years ago. The person who bought it converted the mill into a restaurant. So now we've purchased back the waterfront, and it includes a restaurant. So that rounds out our appeal to visitors. They can come and stay for a day. They can go play in the river, have lunch in the restaurant, go on a tour, get a tasting, buy something, have dinner, and then go home. And that was our goal.
I understand. I don't know whether you want to say this on camera or not, but there is something in the future that you're thinking about this.
Yes, the property, when I sold the property to the person who, before I sold it, I had the main house licensed as a bed and breakfast. So when the guy who bought it, he had that use. He never used it. It's just been a house. But now that we have it, in the beginning we'll use it as a bed and breakfast for our guests of the distillery. Distributors, media, wholesale, people who come here as our invitees. And then eventually we'll put money into the building and upgrade it to be a full service bed and breakfast and inn.
And let's cut sound, cut camera. Next up, let's talk about what that really meant.
Tuthilltown take 3, soft sticks marker.
You're good, Patrick?
Yeah.
Cool. Actually, before we do the products, let's William Grant. So you got William Grant. How did they find you, and then how does that? What are the benefits from that?
In 2008, I went after the Paris and EU market. And a friend of mine made an appointment with the distributor in Paris. I flew over there, we tasted them, and I walked away with a 75-case order. And I think that that's how actually our brand came to the attention of William Grant, because it suddenly started showing up in very high-end restaurants, bars, and hotels in Paris, which was our intention. We wanted it to get some attention in Paris because we knew if it was in those placements in Paris, high-end placements, it would be easier to get into the doors of the restaurants in New York. So I went over there and set it up. We started being distributed around Europe, and that's when Grant's, we actually got a call from them and they said, you keep popping up on our radar. And they wanted to come up and talk to us. They had this innovations line of new products, and they'd been looking for an American whiskey to work with. And so they came up and looked at the place, and they wanted to buy the whole place. But of course, we said, as I said, we weren't going to sell it to them for a pittance because we had just put our whole lives into it. So instead, we sold them the Hudson brand.
And this makes life a little easier.
It makes life a lot easier. They have an international footprint. They have public relations, distribution networks, all the things that the big guns have. They have at their disposal, and they're using it to work on our modest little Hudson brand, and it's been very successful so far.
That's got to give you a sense of we've made it, a little bit of maybe financial stability.
Well, it helps us now because we know we have cash coming in. We have to turn out the product. We're still not a factory because we put it out by hand, but we know we've got a certain quota to meet, and we know they're going to buy it when we make it, which is perfect. I'm sorry, you had asked me another question, sorry.
One thing I was thinking that you mentioned earlier was that it made you feel, what did you say earlier? It wasn't that you made it, but...
Well, it put us on the map. I mean, our teaming up with William Grant's really made the entire industry stand up and take notice, because it was the first American craft whiskey to be picked up and distributed by a major brand. And William Grant is the 6th largest whiskey producer in the world. So they have a long, deep history of experience and knowledge, institutional knowledge about the whiskey business. And we can draw on their technical expertise as well as their experience in the marketplace. And it helps us not to make a lot of mistakes. The major thing that it did for us, it caused us to shift from a little pop and pop operation to an actual business. Because up till that point, when decisions needed to be made, Brian and I would sit down, make the decision, and go. And there was very little, very long-range planning involved. But with an organization like William Grant's, the level that they're operating on, they need to be working a couple of years in advance. They need a stable supply. I mean, if we ran out of product, we could always say to somebody, well, we're out, you'll have to wait for the next batch. And that was often a way of actually stimulating interest. It helped. But once you establish a market, you don't want to run out of product because you lose that space on the shelf. And so that's what our connection with Grant made us step back, pull in our resources a bit, and build up a solid supply inventory. Plus, it also helped us tighten up some of our production methods. And they have an enormous science department. So we were able to send them samples, and they could analyze them and tell us what they actually, chemically, what things were made of and how to balance it better. They helped us with barrel supply, for instance, because they are huge clients of a huge, big cooperage down in Kentucky. And so we were able to get in on their feathers, as it were, to make sure that we had a steady supply of barrels. When we started, we were one of maybe 15 craft distilleries in the whole country. And now there are over 600. And we realized early on that that was going to happen, and that the supply of barrels, especially small barrels, which were what we specialized in, was going to get harder and harder because more demand was going to be. And they weren't building cooperages as quickly as they were building distilleries. And so when we had an opportunity, we bought into a cooperage. And we own a third of it now, and they produce a lot of our barrels for us. But we also draw upon Grant's resources for our full-size 53-gallon barrels, standard Kentucky whiskey barrels.
And when you say you bought into a cooperage, 1/3, is that a Kentucky or Minnesota?
It's in Minnesota. Yeah, our oak comes from Missouri and Kentucky, but the cooperage is in Minnesota. Small, private family operation.
Sounds like a smart thing to do.
Well, yeah, and thank goodness now we did it. We're very happy we did it.
Yeah. Let's cut sound, cut camera, and then we'll talk about that.
Speed. Camera's got speed.
Tuthilltown take 4, soft sticks marker.
Let's talk about your whiskeys first. Where do your ingredients come from? Where do you source from?
Well, for our whiskeys, we're using grain. For our vodka and gin, we use grain and apples. When we started the business, we had it in our head to create a new market for the local farmers, to discourage them from selling off their lands to developers. And that was part of the reason why we went into apples, because the apple farmers were sort of the next on the hit list for the developers. But in the larger scheme of things, having local sources is a great advantage. We can keep track of it. We know the farmers who are growing it. They're guaranteed that their crop is going to sell. We're guaranteed a supply. And also, it is much more efficient from an ecological point of view, because we burn a whole lot less fuel moving our grain supply from 3 miles away than we would if it came from Iowa. If we were shipping it in from the Midwest, we'd be paying more for the shipping than we would for the grain. So now it's just across town. Plus, it engages us with the community, which is very important to us. We want people to feel like this is their hometown distillery. And so the more business we can bring to the local area, the happier we are about it, and the happier everybody else is about it too.
And so in your, let's see, let's start out with your first whiskey. Just maybe take us through the line and
Okay. The first whiskey we made was a clear corn whiskey, because you don't have to age it. We could sell it right away. And we called it Old Gristmill Authentic American Corn Whiskey. When we started making the Hudson line, we moved the corn whiskey into the Hudson whiskey line. So it became part of the 5 brands under the whiskey line. And then we started making aged whiskey. And the first thing we did was to take that corn whiskey and put it into an oak barrel, a new charred American oak barrel. And we used a very small barrel because we couldn't afford to fill big barrels then. So we were using little 2-gallon barrels, ridiculously small and costly. And without realizing it,
let's hold on just a second.
the beep.
Yeah. It's on now. Okay. And then without realizing.
So we started making, started aging the corn whiskey. It's going to keep happening.
It's on a truck.
It's a forklift.
Oh.
And every time it backs up.
Yeah, let's go for it.
So anyway, we started aging whiskey shortly thereafter. And is it that much of
You
it
heard that bad?
interference?
You did.
It's there, but it's not, overpowering anything.
Well, it is a working space.
It is a
after all.
working space. I think when we show some B-roll, people will get that it's a working distillery.
Yeah.
Let's just
Yeah.
go for it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we started aging the corn whiskey just as an experiment to see what would happen. And after a couple of months, I decided to open up the barrel thinking this isn't going to be ready for another year or two, but I wanted to see how it was progressing. And when I took it out of the barrel, it sure smelled, looked, and tasted like bourbon to me. And so we brought it down to an expert in New York City, and she confirmed that this was some pretty fine bourbon, and she bought the entire first batch, which was 128 bottles. And that's when we started really taking off. And then we started experimenting with other types of whiskey, using other kinds of grain, rye, malted barley for single malt. And then we made a 4-grain bourbon, which we still make today. And so the aged whiskey started going out, and they quickly got the attention of the media. First bourbon ever made in New York, and the first legal whiskey made in New York since Prohibition. So we were suddenly everywhere. We also had all of the media attention, which was an enormous advantage. And that went on for until 2007, till the Craft Distillery Act passed.
And what really surprised me, and I didn't realize it because I knew of your whiskeys and your the vodka, but the other products in your line. Maybe just do a quick. What else are you guys making?
Well, we realized after a little while being engaged with William Grant that we were becoming wholly dependent on them and on our Hudson Whiskey brand. And so the logical step to lessen the risk for us was to broaden our product line. And in this business, where you really make the money is when you own the brand. So we were making money by producing this brand for Grants, and that was sort of paying our bills. And then we had a little bit of latitude now to experiment. So we started experimenting with other brands because we didn't want to be reliant on a single product and a single client for the future of the distillery. So we started experimenting first we started reproducing our vodka from apples, and we renamed it as Indigenous. And then we produced a gin, and it's called Half Moon Orchard Gin. And when we started making the gin, again, in our typical way, we wanted to change the foundation of what we were doing. So rather than go to the botanicals bill, which is usually how people manipulate the flavor of gin, they manipulate the botanicals they infuse. Instead of that, we started with the base spirit. Gin is typically made with a grain-neutral spirit to begin with. So we got wheat-neutral spirit from Western New York, and we produced an apple-neutral spirit, and we blended them together. And that gave our gin a very silky mouthfeel. It was an incredibly good choice, and it was made collectively by all of us here. We all tasted it and narrowed it down to that. And then our chief of experimentation, Joel Elder, came up with the formula, and we put that on the market, and that's been successfully spreading out around the country and internationally as well. I was in Singapore and Australia last fall, and I found both of those products on bars in Singapore and in Perth and Melbourne and Sydney. So it's always a great, very exciting to see it up there on a bar in a strange city you've never been before.
Especially that far away.
Oh my God, yeah, the other side of the world. It's quite incredible.
Do you guys make a cacao?
We make a cacao. Joel Elder started with the cacao. We start with the actual beans, and we work with a local chocolatier who takes the beans and prepares them for us, and then they go into the still with the alcohol, and they're leached into the flavors are leached into the alcohol, and then we distill off the alcohol. And that has become very popular. It's a very low-proof item. It's 22% alcohol, but it's got a very rich, deep chocolate quality about it in the nose and also in the flavor. And those are the kinds of things that, for instance, we only sell here. And the idea is that if somebody comes here, if they come back, they're going to find something new. And this is the only place in the world they'll find it, is right here, which is what we hope.
Let's talk a little bit about working with family. You mentioned your son joined at a point. Can you just tell us when he came on, what was the thinking behind that, and how has that worked out? I don't know whether there's other family as well. But.
Well, there is. Actually, we have a variety of family members who are working with us, and we're happy for that. Gabe originally came on board. He had another project he was involved with. He was in the marketing business and advertising business in Manhattan, and he was planning on leaving that to go off into the world on another project, which at the last moment fell through. And so he was sort of stuck without a job and without an apartment in Manhattan and no place to go. So I said, come on up here, we need some help. So he moved in, and for a couple of weeks, we put him to work just digging ditches and carrying stuff. And after a couple of weeks, he went and got an apartment of his own and decided to stay. And he's been here all along. And that's, after a while, we put him on the road selling. And it turned out he had a natural talent for it. And so he became the brand ambassador. And when William Grant came on board, they hired him away from us as the national brand ambassador. And within a year, he was awarded the American Whiskey Brand Ambassador of the Year. by Whiskey Magazine. So he was really a natural for it. He's back here now because he got tired of being on the road so much, and he wanted to be home with his family and his wife. So he's back here now, and he's working with me mostly on visitor services, getting people here. And it's a pleasure. It's a wonderful surprise to be working with family members and actually enjoying it. You know.
What are there challenges?
There are challenges. There are always challenges. You know, you work with somebody and you live with that person, and it's very difficult. And, you know, things are no longer just business. They're also personal. And so you have to take those things into account. But I have a lot of respect for what he does, and I think he feels the same way about what we've done here. So we're willing to give each other some latitude, and he's a lot more experienced out in the field as a brand ambassador, so he has a real feel for the marketplace that I don't have any longer because I've been out of it so long. Now I'm here. And so, but his insight into market trends has been extremely helpful for us.
Where do you, obviously you guys with William Grant, you've grown. Where do you think, just talking a little more generally now, but if you have any thoughts on where the craft distilling movement, if you can call it that, I mean, we're on over 600 nationally now. Where do you think it's going? What's happening?
Well, craft distilling in the U.S. is definitely a movement. It's spreading out around the country. And the distinction to me between just something which is trending and popular and something which is a movement is that a movement changes lives. It becomes a social impact. It has a social impact, not just for fun. And now with all of the small distilleries open up who are getting their goods locally, that means there's a whole new market for the farmers and everywhere where a small distillery opens up. It increases the tourism activity. Last year we brought about 30,000 visitors to Gardner who had never been here before. It creates jobs. And so in that respect, it's more of a movement than it is just a trend. And that's the way we see it going with all of the distilleries that are opening up around the country. A large number of them are opened by people who have no previous distilling experience. And so we're all sort of amateurs out there. But it's good because it presents a sort of collegiate atmosphere. Everybody's sharing information all the time. We may not share proprietary information, special information, but in general, everybody's always helpful. And that's become a great source of inspiration to a lot of people, feeling like they're part of it. We're very active in starting up the American Craft Spirits Association, which is a new industry association for the craft producer. And we also had the first meeting of the New York Craft Distillers Guild here at Tuthilltown, and that now has 55 members and elected officers, so it's really going along well. And we continue to work closely with the state liquor authority because what we discovered right away when we showed up there with questions about distilling and permits was that it was the first time anybody had asked them those questions in 4 generations. And so when we were building our own project and getting our products out on the market, the regulatory structure is very strict. And so we were both learning how to deal with it at our scale. You know, the states and the Fed were used to dealing with industrial producers who put out 10,000 gallons a day. And we were putting out maybe 50 gallons a day at the time. So it's a whole different scale of operation and consideration for the state and the Fed. And a lot of the things that are involved in reporting processes, the big distillers have whole departments and legal departments taking care of that. For me and Brian, it was me and Brian. And we had to learn it as we went. And that's now going on all over the country. But both the feds and the various states have realized in these very tight-pocketed times that the expansion of craft distilling in the U.S. offers a whole new revenue stream, both to the Fed and to the states in regards to excise and sales taxes, and also revenue stream in regards to jobs. And so the states have begun, New York is leading the way, but the other states are following in revising their alcohol production laws to modernize them and help the industry along. Governor Cuomo in New York has made a substantial investment for the state in the artisan beverage industry in New York, which includes craft brewers, craft cider makers, and craft distillers, and small winemakers. And that has led to an enormous resurgence of interest around New York.
When you say he's made an investment, what does that mean? What has he done?
Well, he's put a substantial amount of money into the promotion of the artisan beverage industry for the state of New York. He's moved to include craft distillers with everything the small wineries enjoy, and the wineries have been around for a long time. They have a very strong organization, and they have a lot of weight in all.
Okay.
There's doing a switch over.
Okay.
And they're just like,
Speed. Tuthilltown take 6, marker.
I have a sense you guys there's a kind of a self-sufficiency here. Can you tell us about your solar panels and what you do with your leftovers?
Yeah, well, both Brian Lee and I come from unlikely backgrounds for this. I was a professional climber for 15 years before I started this, and he was an electrical engineer with a specialty in broadcast engineering. And both of us have a real, we really latched on to the notion of self-sufficiency, doing it yourself. We're both of the opinion that, you know, when something needs to get done, you get up and go do it. Don't mess around about it. But also we have a real inclination towards being environmentally sound and trying our best to partially to reduce the costs of operation, but also to zero out our footprint, our carbon footprint. And a couple of ways that we do that is we have 50,000 watts of solar energy collectors out there in the field. And on a sunny day like today, they'll be generating enough electricity to run the entire plant and send electricity back into the grid. And we, at the moment, our waste materials, after we finish with them, we separate the solids from the liquids. The liquids go to Newburgh, to a municipal processing plant. But the solids go to a local cattle breeder who feeds them to her cows and occasionally shows up here with a bag of frozen steaks, which is nice. And the next step, of course, there'll be two steps. One is we've just purchased back the waterfront. And I know Brian has his eyes fixed very carefully on the potential for hydropower that the mill represents, because the mill used water power to run itself. Now that power is going unused, and there's about 75 horsepower being poured back into the river out of the mill every day. So we want to take advantage of that and generate electricity off of it. And the other will be a device which is being engineered for us, and it will be a gasifier. And it will take our waste slurry out of the still when we finish with it, and exactly as it comes out of the still, it will convert it to steam, gas, and then steam. So at that point, we'll be using all of our waste materials to power all of our cooking. Right now, we cook with propane. We cook with steam that we make with propane. And so we have an enormous propane bill every year. This new device should eliminate that entirely. It will also eliminate our need to cart our liquid waste to Newburgh, so we'll save all of the fuel and time and expense of doing that. And it will also make our waste material totally benign when it's finished. And that's a real benefit. So Ideally, the next stage after that, which is very long range and very pie in the sky, is that we hope to seal off our fermentation building and collect all the CO2 and pump it ultimately into a greenhouse that we'll erect next to it. And the greenhouse will be where we can grow greens and things like that for the restaurant. So we're hoping to tie all of those ends together so that it all becomes one unified operation.
Perfect ending. Just real quick, let's go back to the very beginning. Tell us who you are, business you run, and what you guys make.
Sure. I'm Ralph Lorenzo. I'm one of the co-founders with Brian Lee of the Tuthilltown Spirits Distillery in Gardner, New York, in the Hudson Valley. We make spirits including whiskeys and aperitifs, liqueurs, vodka, and gin. And those products are marketed worldwide.
And let's cut sound, cut camera, and then we and we're at Tuthilltown, and we're doing Room Tone with Ralph Lorenzo.
Hi, my name is Joel Elder. I'm the chief distiller here at Tuthilltown Spirits and head of research and development. And I want to show you guys a little bit about how we operate here. Okay. Okay. Hi, my name is Joel Elder. I'm the chief distiller here at Tuthilltown Spirits and the head of research and development. And I want to take you through the distillery and show you a little bit about how we operate. So just go right into it.
Hold on, let's sit down.
Sure. So we make a lot of products here at Tuthilltown, but the most of our products are whiskey. And of course, whiskey starts with grain, which is all from local farms here. This is a rye that we're using to make rye whiskey mash right now. Again, everything's sourced as locally as possible, and that usually means within a few miles of the distillery. Okay. Okay, you want to step in? So whiskey is made from grains. Rye whiskey is made from rye grain, obviously, and the way that we produce. Go again? Okay. Sorry, I lost my place. Where the hell was I going with that? I apologize. Just a second. Okay. So, whiskey is produced from grains. Rye is a small grain that we use to produce rye whiskey. To liberate the starch that will eventually turn into the sugars that will eventually turn into the alcohol, we have to grind the grain itself. So first, the thing that happens is we by hand dump in the grains into this hopper, which are loaded up into a hopper above our mill, which is then mills the grains and drops them into the cook pot here, where they're cooked for approximately an hour at 185 degrees. Okay. I mean, I'm like really abbreviating this, so if you want more, tell me.
Yeah, I just see that.
The thing is, you guys can come back anytime you want. I mean, I don't know what you're lost, but you know.
Yeah, we're a ways away.
Yeah. So I mean, I'll just again, just tell me to expand anything you want. And otherwise, I'll just keep it to brief snippets.
I'm still working through here.
So after mashing in with the grains, we've basically created a sugar water. The grains have released their starches. The starches have been converted into simple sugars, and they're now available for yeast. Before we do that, we have to take them from the cook tank, which we're on the back side of now, through our cooling mechanism, which you see above us, and into the fermenters. And along the way, we pitch them with the yeast and the micronutrients and a few pH buffers that are necessary for that to be a really robust and clean fermentation. The fermenters are right back here, and once we have the yeast pitched into the mash, it moves into the fermenters, and there it'll sit for 5 or so days. It depends really on the schedule before going into the first distillation. Good. So in distillation, there are two major steps: the strip and the rectification. They're happening on. This is the rec, right? Yeah. Is there anything else? Okay, so the one we don't have showing the strip doesn't really matter. It kind of looks the same. And the rectification. You want me to just sort of brief over that? So once our fermentation is complete, we bring it in to begin the distillation. We have pot stills, which mean that they're filled one time, and all of the alcohol is taken from them, and the residue becomes waste. That's opposed to a continuously running still, which is running, can be running all of the time, and that's where you get the idea of the batch process or alembic process. So the first distillation is called the stripping run or the beer strip. There are numerous terms. And we're essentially just taking all of the alcohol and other components that we might want in the final product out and saving them aside. The second distillation is called a rectification, where we're actually separating all of the components in that solution into their various components and selecting the ones that we want to retain in the final whiskey product. That's what's happening in this still over here. That's when the spirit runs clear as water and is essentially pure, raw, unaged, unoaked whiskey. So here we are at our new bottling facility, which is in the middle of our build out. We're receiving new equipment all the time and assembling it as it comes. What this will allow is for us to get past the biggest pinch point, which is a lot of the hand labor that goes into hand bottling. We're still going to be bottling by hand, but simple things like moving bottles from one location to the other takes a tremendous amount of excess labor and time that will be taken off our plate with things like accumulator tables and a little conveyor belt. So that's as automated as we get here. Good. And officially it was running past that because it was used once for a couple of years.
Stuff down.
That would roll from here. Yeah, sure. It's a restaurant. Break off two properties from the original property and sell them, and we were able to reacquire them just in the past few years. So we actually subdivided the property, but then were able to buy it back when we got enough papers. It's probably pretty gratifying, but.
I can't get the ones in the back for exposure. Let me see right here. That's a whole lot of barrels.
That's cool. That's nice.
Yeah, I did a pan.
Good.
I'll pan back. Let's see, I like the first one better. It was a more bigger reveal. Let's go back to here. This would be the end of the other distilleries.